Well, good. All right. Hello again, everyone. Today, I would like to talk about, is your evidence really based? Behaviorist capture, autistic self-advocacy, and librarianship. My name is Dr. Ben Mitchell, they, a librarian and educator with a background in the history of science and medicine. I've also been a curator involved in the public history of mental health and neurodivergence, and I've given a number of talks at various places. So I would also like to say that this work was done on the lens of the Tk'emlúps te Secwepemc within Secwepemc Ulu, the traditional and unceded territory of the Secwepemc. It's important to respect the treaties. Decolonization is not a metaphor. Give the land back now. Every time, you can't see me on the camera, but every time I give a land acknowledgement, I put a loonie aside for a sovereignty, indigenous sovereignty project or a similar group. I started doing this in the winter term, last winter, and since then I have donated $31 to the Orange Shirt Foundation here in Williams Lake, British Columbia, which isn't necessarily a lot, but I think if everyone did that for every single land acknowledgement that would be given, it would represent an important shift of resources towards justice issues. A few content notes, because there's always content notes before we begin. There'll be some discussions of ableism, racism, and child abuse. I use a lot of images of the autism creature. I don't know if any of you are terminally on Tumblr like me, but sometimes creature is spelled funny. That's what that little creature is right there, the autism creature. I think it's delightful. But yeah, so just something to keep in mind. A few points in brief, just to kind of summarize my talk with spoilers beforehand, because everyone is tired. I want to argue that vocational awe of librarians is not unique to librarianship. It can be even more harmful when present in disciplines with more structural power over others, such as ABA or applied behavioral analysis. Claims about the evidence-based nature of ABA and the vocational law of behavioral analysts and technicians is an example of the need for interdisciplinary oversight and standards of evidence. And librarians kind of having an insider-outsider status in relationship to concepts of literacy and systematic reviews makes us particularly well placed to trouble the vocational awe of other disciplines when it comes to interdisciplinary issues such as arguably human rights. That's a pretty big interdisciplinary issue. But what are the boundaries of librarianship? Those of you who are librarians will know the concept of vocational awe, coined by Fobazi Attar. But basically the notion of our sense of librarianship as a calling, as a mission, means that we will both do things and put up with things that we wouldn't otherwise do if we didn't think of it as a kind of intrinsic virtue. In a religious sense. Actually, Fobazi Attar in her original paper is very explicit about that, as it having connections to religious traditions. Theorists who've thought about the kind of nature of librarianship, like Marcia Bates, have argued that librarianship is a meta-discipline, which means that subject expertise is nice but not essential, that really what we organize is information. That's always struck me as a little bit wishy-washy. Perhaps other people have stronger thoughts on Bates's position here, because I would like to argue that there's subject expertise, but there's also a concept of interdisciplinary expertise, and importantly, for our purposes, expert subjects, right? Neurodivergent folks being expert subjects on our own experiences. So then the question is, what happens though when one discipline goes about studying or critiquing another from its own lens? Well, the truth of the matter is this really isn't my first rodeo. This is, in fact, my second rodeo. My background in history of science and technology means I'm familiar with the science wars that actually happened in the 1990s, when sociologists, historians, philosophers of science, using those things like the sociology of scientific knowledge, started to try to unpack how science is done by focusing on it as a human activity, as a socially structured activity. This led to the Sokal affair, in which a scientist, Alan Sokal, published a hoax in a social science text, sinking that journal. There's a whole story there. But it can get quite intense, basically, when one discipline goes about trying to critique or comment on another discipline. These are, I like to say, academic authority is in some ways sophisticated turf wars, right? Between different disciplines. We're vying for resources. We're vying for all of these sorts of things. People can be very prickly and defensive. And I think in a lot of ways, as librarians, particularly my role as an academic librarian, we kind of actually help to reinforce this in some ways, in ways that we don't always fully realize, right? In the general information literacy workshop distinction, right? I don't know if you folks have done this or seen it done, but you make a distinction between trade journals, which, represent a specific industry and aren't peer reviewed and don't have the gold standard and can be kind of trusted, but are kind of in a middle ground, versus academic journals, which are peer reviewed and are a gold standard, right? And that these two things, industry standards versus peer or systematic reviews, are fundamentally different entities, right? As opposed to saying, well, peer or systematic reviews are the kind of industry standards of academic knowledge production. And so I'd like to argue that that kind of distinction is a little bit too simple, because it kind of gets academics and academic librarians and peer review system, it lets it off the hook. Right? Because in many ways it does. Peer reviews do, by definition, represent the interests and the attitudes of that peer group, that discipline, right? That industry, even if that industry happens to be sociology or physics or applied behavioral analysis. But what is just applied behavioral analysis, as stated? I suspect a lot of you are probably familiar with this, but just want to go over it in brief. Based on the work of B.F. Skinner, 1938 theory of operant conditioning. ABA, or applied behavioral analysis, is, at least by expert proponents, is evidence-based. That term comes up a lot when people talk about why ABA is effective, but arguably they seek to correct behavior deemed inappropriate or socially undesirable through intervening in that behavior in a way. And this work is done by Dr. Julia Grusin-Wood, who I'll be referring to a lot in this talk. She was a colleague of mine at York University. So again, Julia's work, Dr. Grusin-Wood's work, she kind of summarizes ABA as this. It uses positive and negative reinforcements and sometimes aversives to target skills and behaviors requiring improvement and replacement. Again, that's the language that's used in the ABA literature. Even though, aversives are child abuse, right? Slapping, hitting, taste aversives, electric shocks. And while a lot of ABA practitioners will consider this unethical and outdated, in Dr. Grusin-Wood's kind of anthropological and ethnographic studies, 5 of their informants, as well as colleagues in the autism field, witnessed providers to apply them, and one informant to discuss doing them themselves. And this is, again, just going back, this is from a paper from 2016. So this is not, air quotes, bad old days of ABA. Right? Parents are encouraged to apply ABA methods to children during every waking hour. Now, in some versions of this talk for an holistic audience, I did have this picture of Ivar Lovaas's methods for treating autistic children in edition of Life magazine from 1965. It's upsetting. So I'm just know that this was an open secret, that children were being treated this way. It was on the cover of, it was in the pages of Life magazine in the 60s. So this wasn't kind of considered shameful at the time period. So then let's just talk a little bit about the concept of being evidence-based. What do we mean by evidence-based, right? Because this, again, comes up a lot, right? Agencies that are not autistic-led dismiss criticisms of ABA by emphasizing the fact that that ABA is an evidence-based intervention. Evidence-based is treated as this kind of sacrosanct entity. But it too has a history, and it has a meaning that often gets kind of obscured, right? Because originally it comes from medicine as evidence-based medicine, right? And in one of the main discussions of it in Sackett et al. From 1996, right, they argue that the practice of evidence-based medicine means integrating individual clinical expertise with the best available external clinical evidence from systematic research. So already you have these concepts of it's important to have external evaluation. It's important to have a model of systemic, research that goes beyond any kind of one individual or even an individual group. And so evidence-based gets thrown around so much in so many contexts, but those are kind of some of the key elements of it, right? You need external evidence, you need systematic research. But even going into that, what does systematic research even mean within these contexts, right? Because when you internally look into the ABA literature as a discipline, if you look at systematic reviews on ABA methods, right, that are in favor of what they call its, quotes, effectiveness, right? How are they defining effectiveness in this context? They're defining effectiveness as compliance. Can you make the child obey you? They're defining effectiveness in terms of eye contact. They're defining it in terms of, are the parents satisfied? They're defining in terms of, are the children playing in the right way, right? Are the children avoiding the people who are trying to control them or not, right? All of these sorts of things are, are they preventing the children from stimming? When people say that ABA is effective based on systematic reviews, oftentimes what they mean is it's effective in those things. They don't necessarily talk about health or wellness or long-term outcomes. These are the things they're talking about when they reference systematic reviews, talking about the effectiveness of ABA. So you really need to unpack, yeah, even when you're referencing systematic reviews, how are they defining their terms? How are they defining effectiveness? And is it just internal to the discipline, or is it also external? So this is where an element of Dr. Goossen's work that I call discipline as discipline, right? Because she does a really good job of unpacking in this essay of hers how behavioral therapists are themselves subjected to disciplinary techniques that mirror the ones they apply to their autistic subjects. So basically, they're internalizing the norms quite extensively. This is just one example. I won't read it out loud at full, but basically where an ABA practitioner was like, had not effectively internalized, preventing a child from putting their hands in their pockets because heaven forbid they play with a string in their pocket, because that's stimming, and stimming isn't allowed for ABA to be effective. And then the ways in which they internally chide themselves and build up this kind of mutual system of self-monitoring and externalized monitoring to reinforce the ABA practitioner's behavior as the norm, even when before they became an ABA practitioner, it wasn't, right? And this gets done to the parents of autistic children as well, right? Dr. Goosenwood is very clear in the way that how she describes, right, way the parents, rationalize not really looking after their children. And this quote, Anita's rationale for not doing the normal cultural things like giving her children milk and toys or changing their diapers is for them to perform the exercises required to conquer the spectrum thing. Like Maya, Anita separates her ethical framework from mainstream cultures by adopting a behavioral paradigm of personhood and care. You really have to kind of be captured by this entire worldview, both as a practitioner and as a parent who's being trained to do this to your child 24/7. And here I want to kind of just talk a little bit about kind of then some of the evidence that gets talked about in terms of, systematic reviews, right? Historically, we know that there's a very long record of ABA systematic reviews not actually, citing null findings, i.e. cases in which, they didn't actually find any effectiveness on the part of the, air quotes, treatment. And then this really skews, again, the nature of those systematic reviews. If you're only reporting on the effective ones, well, of course, you're going to say it's effective because you're not, reporting null findings. And this isn't unique to ABA. It's kind of endemic in a lot of the sciences, but it's particularly relevant here when it's dealing with something which I personally consider to be child abuse, right? And you see this a lot more from kind of external reviews from other kind of psychological fields and other disciplines, right? Like in this one case, 70% of reports were coded for a greater than one conflict of interest, but only 6% of reports contained conflict of interest statements fully accounting for all coded conflict of interest. So there's already a huge issue there, right? Also, they systematically underreport adverse outcomes. About 1/3 of the studies that monitored adverse effects reported that one occurred, right? It is likely that adverse events and effects are somewhat common at the study level, but just don't get talked about. That's not something that's considered in their systematic reviews of effectiveness. Some of you probably already heard about that the American Armed Forces actually have also done an external review of the effectiveness of ABA services because of it's a budgetary thing for them partially, right? A lot of children from military families, particularly in the States, are mandated to have this have ABA treatment. It's very common to have it, but the military is quite interested to see if it was worth their money. And in the military's internal reporting, they have found that there's no significant addition to the evidence-based literature have been published since the last annual report, where they were like, it's not actually medically proven. The report also stated that a continued concern with this program is the ongoing fraud, waste, and abuse by ABA providers. So once you get outside of the discipline of ABA as a practice, you start to notice a lot of cracks forming in how we're defining systematic reviews, how we're defining external clinical evidence. I won't list all of these off, but there's a huge and growing body of literature about the relationship between ABA and PTSD, hidden harms, all sorts of issues with the practice as soon as people from outside the discipline start looking into it. And it brings up this one quote, which I thought was really striking, by Skedy and Sandanova Norton, right? That the issue is not whether or not ABA therapists follow their own ethics code. The issue is the ethical scope of the practice of ABA, given that the practice of ABA inherently ignores all internal constructs, right? It doesn't treat people as having an interiority. It's just there's the behavior and there's the intervention you do to control the behavior. And you're not really seeing a person as a person there within that paradigm, within that model of human psychology, lots of, I don't know what to call it. It's lots of things. And this brings me to kind of my final point. This is kind of peak vocational awe, because ABA therapists, once they become internalize the norms of ABA and like, oh, only you can care for these children, only you can do this. This is the most scientific thing. It's for their own good, so on and so forth. It gets to things like this, which was published quite recently. No Irish, no behavior analysts, no dogs, in which the authors basically state that being an ABA therapist gets you as much prejudice against you as, you know, immigrants around World War II, or in that case, right, that saying, it was no Irish, no blacks, no dogs. So they've replaced black folks and put in their own discipline. And so they're thinking of their discipline as an ethnic category. It's really messy. It's incredibly messy. And I think it does kind of evince what happens, some of the intense dangers of vocational awe, particularly when they have more structural power over others. Now, I'm glad I actually recorded and got this article, because shortly after from the kickback, and again, here I should say in the abstract, they say that it's evidence-based, enshrined in evidence-based practice. But the kickback to this article meant that quietly, without actually telling anyone, they changed its name. They changed its name. They changed the abstract, right? They don't talk about evidence-based practice in the abstract anymore. They talk about rights-based practice, but it's the same paper more or less. They've kind of tweaked it to be kind of like, you know, like not say the quiet part out loud as much, but I think it's quite telling that that they did this, first of all, and that they had to do this, secondly, that this isn't okay. And I think that, again, arguably, yeah, librarianship, because we wrestle with vocational law, because we think about standards of evidence, because we think about literacy, what is the nature of a systematic review, the peer review process. I think it's really important for us, and knowledge workers in general, to really unpack these systems of knowledge validation, because a lot of abuses can be rationalized under them if no one else outside of the discipline is looking in. And that's the points I wanted to make. Thank you kindly. Oop.